Okay, cool. Well, hi everyone, thanks for having me here again. My name is Peter Field. I graduated from this course, I think 11 years ago now, maybe 10, no, 11 years ago. And I've been a game designer in the industry ever since. So I've put together a talk about level design, which is like my favourite aspect, I think, of game design. It's the area I feel most comfortable in. And we'll just go through, I think what I've done is I've like laid out 50 tips. Not all of them are always applicable. You sort of pick and choose little bits when you sort of need inspiration. But we'll hand out this talk afterwards, and you can all have it. It's just a PowerPoint presentation you can scroll through. And if you're ever stuck for level design stuff, it might be useful. And I think it's useful for artists as well, because it's a lot about sort of blocking geometry out to sort of communicate ideas or to get the player to do certain things. Okay, cool. So I think actually I'm going to immediately go off piece and just quickly sort of show you some of the little bits. This will give you an idea of like the type of things that I want to talk about. So I've collated all of these tweets that I've put together from, I think, on Blocktober, which is exactly the kind of thing which I'll be talking about today. And Blocktober is like throughout the month of October, level designers all around the world will share their sort of blockouts. They're sometimes called white boxes, they're sometimes called grey boxing. But basically it's the quickest, easiest, dirtiest way of making geometry to communicate everything you want to communicate to the art team or the animation team or whoever else is going to sort of be working on the same project as you. So it's not about being neat, it's not about being like adding lots of detail. It's about putting enough detail in so it communicates things to the player or to the art team. It should be completely playable at this point, and that's where the communication aspect comes in. So like this is something that I made in Dreams just really quickly. It uses about 4 modules, so this was sort of just trying to like use lots of modular pieces to make an interesting space. This is one of the first levels I ever worked on. You guys probably don't remember a game called Enslaved, Journey to the West. Maybe. Yeah, so this is a level, it's like a ruined, I don't remember what city it is. It's a ruined city. And that's like a before and after. Some more before and afters of the same area. This is like a crane area. And then the artists start to put in atmosphere and volumetrics, and then they do an art pass, but it hasn't been baked and it hasn't been lit. And then this is the finished product, so it shows sort of like how it goes. This is a block out of a level that I made for Devil May Cry. And you can see that sort of everything is very messy and dirty, but it communicates what's happening. So like these buildings are crushing together in like the most basic form. Yeah, I think as long as you convey the emotion and the feeling, then you're kind of good to go. You don't really need to do too much more than that, because it's a bit of a waste of time to do more than that. This is a level that I made on The Last of Us, and you can compare the block out with the final area. The videos don't perfectly line up, but you can see a lot of the shapes and the geometry are similar. I go through this whole giraffe sequence. I think that's probably all of the good. Oh, there's some like any DLC. This is quite cool. This is just really, really quick time lapse of me building a space. This is the space that I said used very few modules, or I think it's a very similar space. It's using the same modules. There's my skinny puppet, our default character in Dreams. Now, well, yeah, it is the same space, isn't it? So that kind of thing, if that interests you, I will make a house here. Then this talk will sort of show you a lot of the design principles that go into making spaces like that. Okay, so it's going to start really dry, just get through the first 3 slides and we'll get to some fun stuff. So solids and voids. So these are just sort of like vocabulary when we're talking about building spaces. solids are the things that you put down in the space, so they're the boxes. When you're grey boxing, that's a box, that's a solid. But actually the space that the player experiences is the void made up between the spaces between the solids. So like these tables are solids, these walls are solids, but I'm going to inhabit the space between the tables and the walls. So that's really simple. Positive and negative space. So when you make a room with 4 walls, you're making a positive space, basically because you're intentionally making a space between these solids. And then if you go outside and you see the spaces between the buildings, they're negative spaces because they're not necessarily as designed, it's just sort of like the spaces that happen to be there between buildings. So it's like intentional spaces versus like unintentional spaces or accidental spaces, and you'll notice that players will definitely naturally gravitate towards positive spaces from negative spaces. So if you want the player to go somewhere, make a positive space and they'll move towards it. I think that's all of the, that's all the boring stuff out of the way. That's all the vocabulary, all the sort of like, I don't know, the academic stuff. And now we can just get on to things that I've discovered as I've gone. So some of these they're going to be caveats for all of these, like the positive negative space thing. Works when you're in a broader game, so you've got really wide levels and players have the potential to get lost. If it's a more narrowly sort of like focused linear game, it won't be as important. Be bold. So this goes for basically everything up until VR. When you get to VR, the rules change. So be bold just means that like when you're making a 3D space, you're communicating a 3D space, but it has to get transferred to the player's eyes via this 2D screen. So a lot of detail and nuance about sort of a space can get sort of lost because you've sort of like lost a lot of information by crushing it to 2D, just naturally because, you know, like technology. And so you'll notice that a lot of games exaggerate geometry. They'll like have a cartoony art style because it's easier to read, or geometry will just be much bigger than you would expect because it's easier to read, and that's because they want to communicate what these objects are to the player. So like that's an example of a really chunky building, but it reads really well because you get these nice big shadows where the sun hits like the door frame, and really that would not be visible if like you made it realistic. And we talk more about this later, but like depending on your camera, how far away your camera is from your player. So if you go first person, your camera's really close to the player. It's like it is your player. And as you go to like sort of third person and then pulled out to like a much like almost like RTS view, the further away your camera is from your player, the more you're going to have to exaggerate your geometry because the camera is further away from things. So you don't think about where your character is, you think about where your camera is because the camera is your eyes. Okay. So if the player can see everything, they will lose interest. So if I was to walk into this room right now and I was to look at this part of it, this is not going to help the video, is it? So I'm looking at a room and I can see everything in it. There's no sort of hidden areas. Maybe I can not see behind some of the tables, but it's not super exciting. And I'll lose interest and I won't move around because I don't need to move around to see things. If I look over to the right, where you've got these big boards that sort of include the second classroom, and they create these sort of little like nooks and crannies that I can't see behind, that is sort of, I think it's called designing for mystery. Like I want to see what's behind those walls, so I'm going to move until I can see behind those walls. So just think about that when you're sort of like making a space. You want the player to move around, so you want to design areas that the player can't see all of the environment from one specific vantage point, because if they can see everything, they will just not move around and they'll get bored. So I've just described all of this already. Just show the player things that they can't see. So that would be sort of like, so this screenshot in contrast to these screenshots here, where you can see everything in them. It's got some higher balconies, which you want to sort of get on top of. It's got some windows, and it's got some like corners around like the edges of those buildings. So the player will want to move around to see or like explore these spaces thoroughly. Show the player things that they can't get to. So this is kind of like, you have to use this very carefully, because if you show players things that they can't get to and they legitimately will never get to them, but they look exciting, that'll just frustrate people. But if you understand that rule and you say, and if you look at an you make a level and then you play it as a player, not as the person that designed it, and you see an opportunity for like an area that looks really enticing, like an open window and a balcony, then you can use that to sort of draw the player to that position. So even if it's really difficult to get to, you know that because it's exciting and it's sort of like this mysterious place that they can't get to, they will really, really try hard to get there. So you can maybe hide a really cool secret in there and have a really cool route that's difficult to find around the back of the building, and everyone will find it because you've signposted something really exciting with this open window. Maybe you'd have like, I don't know, one of those like circular fans spinning because movement draws attention as well. Maybe like a curtain billowing in the breeze, and like it's just so exciting to people when they can see things that they can't get to, and they're like, that's a challenge. I'm going to take on that challenge and try and get into that building. So when you're blocking out a space, the quickest thing to do is to sort of define the area of your level by putting big walls around everything. And big walls just sort of kill mystery. They're just not exciting because you know it's like, I can't get past that. So wherever possible, try and think of alternatives to walls that do exactly the same thing. So you could use a really, really high drop. Say if this level was like high up on a skyscraper, then like you've got a nice vista now over to the left on this screenshot here. But it's still blocking the player. They can't go anywhere because they'll just fall to their death. So that is like a really good way of doing it. A lot of games just use the sea because it's pretty good. I remember, I think there's an architect, no, it was a filmmaker, and she said the sea is the opposite of a wall. I just thought that was really beautiful because it's like, it does the same thing. It stops you from going out there, but it is the opposite. It evokes adventure and space, and just like, it's just the biggest horizon you've ever seen. But a wall is just like, stop. So entering a space from a privileged perspective. So this is sort of a very specific one, and this is clearly, I wrote this shortly after coming back to England from Naughty Dog, because this is an Uncharted setup, if ever I saw one. But it applies to a lot of things. So it would apply to like pretty much any game with challenge in it. So what I'm saying is, if you're going to enter a space that is quite a complicated space, like often in things like Uncharted, a combat space is quite complicated because you need lots of options for the player to utilise. So lots of routes, it will be a wide open space, and there'll be lots of places the player can go. If you want them to understand that space properly, then you should probably show them it before they enter into combat, because when you're in combat, or when you're in, so it's not necessarily combat, but in like a challenging situation, you can't really take in all of the detail of the environment under duress. So in this example, you would sort of enter the space really quietly. You can't be seen, but you can see everyone else. You've got a high up vantage point, and you can take in the environment, maybe like plot a route, maybe like lay a plan. It'll all go to pot in like 10 minutes. That doesn't matter at all because you've been given the opportunity to have an advantage here. And then they can choose when to drop into the environment and take on that challenge. So you could do the same sort of thing with like, say if it was like a platforming game, like Mario, you might show the player like a moving platform puzzle with like some enemies on it, and they fall off the platforms before the player actually goes onto them. So you're sort of introducing that idea to the player before they have to actually take it on. I think that's actually a very different kind of example, so ignore what I said. Subvert expectations. So this is sort of saying, I think you might have heard them referred to as beats or as like moments or motifs, but basically like you can kind of divide games up into small sections and small chunks, and the idea is that you don't really want to repeat a beat. You don't want to have the same idea repeated too many times. So you don't want to repeat a beat or repeat a motif because games are so engaging that players will like notice it like that. They'll be like, I've already done this, so I know what to do. So it's boring. Like you play things to experience new experiences, and if you in the same game you come across the same combat setup or the same puzzle twice, it will be very noticeable to players. So something that you can do is like subvert expectations. So you can either try and create 400 new like unique beats or motifs. That's very difficult to do. And sometimes you might come up with one motif and you'll be like, this is really good, I wish I could just reuse this here and just tweak it a bit. So that's subverting expectations. So the player will come up to the situation and be like, I know what's going on, I recognize what's happening, so I'm going to do exactly the same thing as before. And then you twist it so that what they did before doesn't work anymore. So here it's the same setup, but instead of like letting the player take their time to sort of survey the combat area before jumping into it, we have the guard patrol come around the corner, flush them out of cover, and then they have to jump into the same environment, but without the advantage of like being able to plot a plan. And that would be something that's quite mean to do to the player. So you do that much later in the game, and the first one where you sort of enter a space from a privileged perspective, that's the kind of thing you do right at the start of the game. So basically, I'm just saying like there's a load of rules, and you can also break them all. It's fine. You can do whatever you want. So I've got loads of slides now about like really, this might be very, very simple, obvious geometry stuff, but I've never heard anyone else talk about it, so I thought I might bring them in. So this goes back to what I was saying about geometry being hard to read in video games, especially when like art passes start happening and like detail gets added. It's obviously very easy to read these things in block mesh, but it will get harder. So exaggerating all of the geometry and actually using geometry to sort of communicate ideas to players. So inviting the player into a space, because on the left-hand side, they might not realize, they might just think that's like an alcove. They might not realize that there's a staircase or a route that goes behind that wall. But if you see stairs, stairs have like a natural like affordance that players understand. So like an affordance is something that like does something for the player. So like a door affords opening and walking through, a window affords opening and walking through, stairs afford walking up. So you notice the stairs at the bottom because they're poking out too far, which if you were an architect that would be quite bad because people might trip over this. But as a game designer, it's actually quite good because it shows the player like the stairs really clearly. And you're like, stairs lead somewhere, so that must lead somewhere, so I'll go along there. Also, like using curved walls will really help because that basically creates two leading lines that sort of curve around the corner, which sort of basically create this big arrow that says there's something around here. So that's really, really useful. And an archway I think is probably the most powerful because like that again, when I was saying like a door affords walking through, a doorway is like a really recognizable shape to people now, like doors and windows. So if you create an archway, that creates a portal that you want to move through. That's like a really, really strong indicator that there's something behind it. And then you can layer these up. Like, don't ever worry about being too heavy-handed with this kind of thing because all it is it's good communication. So you don't want to. There's times when you want to be obtuse and obscure and make the player think about it and make the player feel uneasy. And there's times when you want things to be really, really obvious. And you'll be really surprised if you play, I guess you guys, everyone already knows, you folks know, if you play test your levels, you're like, I can't believe they didn't see that. That was really, really clear to me because you made it. So you have to be extra, extra clear when you're giving the game to other people. So layering up like those little rules can really, really help. And I would be really surprised if anyone didn't notice that there was like a path on an image on the right at this point. So there's a problem, I think, there's a million ways to solve it, and everyone's been solving it for years, but like, you'll come up against this thing in game design where you want to show the player something that they can't get to necessarily. So if they can't get to it, which it probably means they can't see it because you're going to block their path with something. And if they can't see it, how do they know it's there and how do they know they want to get to it? So this is sort of about, if you've got like a secret in another room, don't hide it. Try and make it really, really visible to the player. And you can do this in a number of ways. So like here I've just sort of like got this partition wall, which doesn't quite go to the floor and doesn't quite go to the ceiling, and a big light behind it sort of shining through. So these are the same two spaces, but you would never even think to look behind the wall on the left, but you would on the wall on the right. so this is sort of talking about how our experience of a space is strongly influenced by the area that preceded it. So it's basically like you're plotting out how a level feels overall, like the long-term sort of journey that the player will go on. So each space individually might be incredible, but if they're all very similar, then the player's sort of emotional experience will sort of be very similar and sort of plateau as throughout, which can sort of, it can make everything feel a bit sort of like meh, I think is the best word. That's a real word, I'm sure. So the way that you would combat this is you would try and organize your spaces so that they create like a really varied graph of like the player's emotional experience. So you'd have like areas of low tension, followed by areas of high tension, back to like low tension, like long areas of like nothing, followed by punctuated by like really sharp areas of like action, and that will intensify both of them. It will make the slow areas feel cathartic, because you want them after like an area of high intensity, and it will make the areas of high intensity feel more intense because they've come from an area of low intensity. So this is an example in geometric terms. If you've got like a small, dark, narrow, claustrophobic area preceded, and after it comes like a really wide open, airy, light space, that will feel wider and lighter and more open and more airy if it comes after like the dark one. Whereas if you have two sort of cathedrals in a row, you'd be like, it's another cathedral. It's epic. It's similarly epic. And so to make things more impactful, you sort of vary up your pacing as much as possible. This is something that I think, like, when I started in the industry, this wasn't how it worked, because I think materials weren't as good. But now, like, materials and textures are so good that you kind of can rely on this to be a really, really strong indicator. So another way of like helping communicate like geometry is by sort of using the specular highlights that the sun will give you. So if you're sort of going towards the sun, you'll see lots of these shiny surfaces where the sun sort of glances off it and comes straight at you. Because in the past, sort of like N64 days, I know that's like you were all like 3 years old when that was around. But in N64 days, you'd probably have like the sun really high and looking down at like an angle, because then it's sort of, it would be similar to like this image on the left, because then you get like a nice varied, a different shade of shadow on each side of like a cube. And it can be quite easy to read if materials are all quite flat. But when materials can be like wet and can reflect sunlight, you'll notice like a lot of modern games will do this kind of thing. And you'll actually notice like there's a lot of games where you're always going towards the sun. So you'll like spend half the level going like east, you're going towards the sun, then you're going to a building and you'll go west, and you come out and you're still going towards the sun because it's so useful, it's so effective. And it just makes your materials like really sick. It's not really something that you can just do this after you've built the level, it doesn't really matter. Oh, now you've got loads of slides about doors. I hope people like doors. This definitely comes back from my Naughty Dog days, because that was sort of quite grounded, like, especially like The Last of Us, we made lots of like human environments, and we thought a lot about doors, which was unusual, I think. So I'm going to make you all sit through this too. So this is not necessarily to say that one is right and one is wrong, but again, it sort of says, like, think about this stuff, and does this support your the emotional experience that you're trying to create? So if you were to walk up to a door and it opens towards you, that's going to feel like, that's going to slow the pace down, and it's going to push the player back, so you have to like stop, move back, open it, and then walk forward. So if it was like a chase sequence, you would not do that. You would have the door open in the direction that you're going, so you can just barge through it and run. And that will feel much more fluid and much more sort of and much faster. But if it was a horror game and you're trying to frustrate the player and slow them down, then maybe you'd use the example on the right. So it's just sort of saying that like these are all appropriate in different circumstances. but think about it because it's not irrelevant. It's never irrelevant. Like I think there was, I think I saw a comedy once where like this guy, like everything was going wrong for him that day, and he walks up to some sliding doors and he's like following somebody, and the automatic doors open for the person he's following, and then they close for him, and he bumps into them. So that's like, obviously it's a bit of technology is malfunctioning, but like it communicates his frustration and his sort of like the fact that he feels like the whole world's against him. So it's mirroring whatever emotional experience you're trying to create with really practical things like doors and chairs and tables. It's really funny. So I would say, again, this depends on the kind of context, but most people will probably, without thinking it's important, put a door smack in the middle of a room. And I think that's actually quite a frustrating way to enter a room, because if you enter and you want to look at the whole room, you have to turn that way to check that corner, and then turn a whole 180 to check that corner. Whereas if you look at the example on the left, you just enter, turn a bit, and you can see the whole room. So, and that's not to say that one is right and one is wrong, but if you're wanting sort of a fairly easygoing experience for the player, and you want to be nice to the player, maybe go for the example on the left. If it's a horror game and you want people to be like, I really want people to be like, feel on edge and nervous, then maybe the example on the right is more appropriate, because you know that you could even do some really weird things like, so like this example on the right, you could hide like an enemy behind this door, and then you could enter it, and the door's opening in a really annoyingly obstructive way, so that it sort of blocks a whole section of the room, and you have to like, and so that would be good for a horror game, and not for something like Uncharted, where you want a more breezy experience. That's all my door stuff. I hope people enjoyed that. Present a simple problem. So this is going to go more into like puzzle design. So it's really, I'm just going to read this because I can't remember what I wrote. So you want your puzzles to be difficult. That's fair enough. But you don't want what the puzzle is to be difficult. You want that to be crystal clear. This comes again to sort of like communicating things really thoroughly and really like clearly to players. So you here, for example, this single image presents a very, very simple problem, an age-old problem. There's a door and it's locked. You could make the key as obtuse as possible to find. You could make that part of the puzzle really difficult because you've established this really clear rule and objective for the player, which is find the key. So that just sort of like is a very clear example of like a really, really simple problem that's clearly communicated, and then from then on you can start to make things much more complicated. Because it feels really unfair when you enter a room and you don't know what the puzzle is meant to be. Like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. So as long as you've established the puzzle and the player knows what they need to do, then they won't get frustrated with you. They'll get frustrated with themselves for like not being able to work out the puzzle. It's a bit more fair, basically. Problem solution ordering can be a problem because it's quite hard to avoid, I think. Basically, if you come into an area and you accidentally stumble across, you start exploring and you stumble across the key before you find the door, then it kind of makes them both completely redundant, because then when you get to the door you're like, oh, I used that key I found. So it may as well have been unlocked because you haven't had this sort of like, oh, I've got a problem, I've got to solve it, I'll go solve it, I'll come back. Yeah, solve the problem. You haven't got that feeling, that ordering, that sort of like mental path. Basically, you just walked up to a door and used the key. So you've got to be very careful about how you sort of like stage these areas. So you would start by sort of introducing the door. Ideally, you could do something where the solution is not even possibly accessible until you've tried the door. So maybe you would do something where you go up to the door and you try and open it, it doesn't open, so you shake it really hard, and it like maybe knocks a bookcase over, which allows you to get to another area where the puzzle is staged, and then you have to explore that area to find the key. This is very sort of simple, but I want it to be like a clear example. So we're going with keys and doors. So I hope that makes sense. So this is talking about prepping areas for artists, because when you block mesh and you sort of lay out a level, you might not put in all of the furniture. So if you were to make this room, you would just put the 4 walls in, and you would come into it and it would feel really huge, right? It would feel massive. It's like a cavernous space. And then an artist would come in and be like, oh yeah, it's a classroom though, so I'm going to put like desks all around the sides of the walls, which reduces your like floor space by like 2 meters, basically a meter on each side. And then they would place loads and loads of desks in the middle as well. And all of a sudden the space was really tiny because you've added loads of furniture. So what I often do is even if I never say that this is gospel, I say that this stuff can be moved around and the artists can replace it with whatever they want. But I would just chuck in a bunch of blocks that I think represent sort of like coffee tables, couches and bookcases and things like that, because it gives me a better idea of how big the space will feel once it is full of furniture. You'll notice this if you've ever like moved house or anything. You're like, this place looks massive, and then you move your furniture and you're like, oh, I can't even move, it's tiny now. So it's sort of psychological, like the space, the actual floor space here, the grey space that you can see is like probably half of what it is in the picture on the left, because you don't walk across tables when you're moving around the space. You might do, but you should. Okay, I've already touched on this. So the camera is part of the player's head. When you experience a game, you experience it from the camera's perspective, not actually the player's perspective. So if you think about things like World of Warcraft, or like getting onto like RTS cameras, the camera is really far away, and that means that like the geometry is going to have to be bigger, because actually you don't have to just fit the character through it. You have to fit. Basically, if you draw a whole sphere around the player that encompasses the player and the camera, then that is the size of the thing that has to fit through a doorway. So that's why you'll notice, like, sort of the closer to first-person perspective games get, the sort of more realistically proportioned everything is, because they can be, because the camera is closer. And it's really strange, but even in first-person, things are like, I don't know, like 25% larger than they would be in real life, even though the camera is right in the player's eyes. I think that's got something to do with field of view. I think basically when you get to VR, things are realistically proportioned, because it feels really weird when it's not, but up until that point, like everything is like slightly scaled up, and the further the camera out is, the further the camera is away from the player, the more things are scaled up. Giving the player the benefit of the doubt is sort of, it kind of depends on the game and the mechanics that you're choosing, but I just think it's really interesting that when you're playing a game, in the real world, you're like really able and dexterous, and you can sort of like, I don't know, so say if I wanted to like slip through a really small gap, I could do that, I could squeeze through a small gap. Or if I wanted to pick something up really specifically, I can do that really easily, and I can catch things and things like that. But in the game, you've just got these like very clumsy, very limited interaction inputs. So you've got like analog sticks, so you can maybe, if you were trying to sort of get a character to stop on like a very specific point on the floor, you'd probably overshoot it a lot because you haven't got that much control. And because you haven't got that much control, I feel like we have to put a lot of systems in place to compensate for what players could do in the real world. Just because if you can't do something in a game that you can't do in real life, you'll start to be like, that's a bit frustrating, I don't really like that. So in the past we've done things like we've basically stopped players from like walking off edges, because in the real world you'll never accidentally walk off a building. Your body will stop you doing that. But it's things that you might not notice are happening behind the scenes, but you have to think about as a designer to make sure that the play experience isn't frustrating. So making doors open automatically, yeah, things like that. Or like if the player does fall off a ledge, maybe make them turn and grab it, because that would be your natural reaction in real life, and you'll have to build a system to do that for the player in the game. So when you're building a space, you build it to a certain scale, and then you might put your character in there, and the character might have been built by someone else, or might have been built by you in a completely separate session or something, and it might have a movement speed which just feels really wrong in that space. Maybe they move way too fast for this closed and claustrophobic space. Something will feel really off. And it's not one thing that needs to change. So I think all of these three things are interlinked, so they all play off each other. And between the three of them, you'll find a sort of tone for your game, which will feel unique to your game. So camera distance, character movement, and environment scale are all completely linked. So, for example, if you want a game where you move really fast, you're going to need the camera to be pulled out further so you can see more of your environment in front of you. If you think about a racing game, when you're on the starting line, the camera's really close, and as soon as you accelerate, the camera gets pulled further away. That's so that you can see more environment around you, which means you can react to more environment around you. Same with like players. So if you're moving fast, your camera's far out, which means and as before I said, remember that like think of the size of the player as like a sphere that encompasses the camera and the player. So you're moving fast, which means your camera's far out, which means your environment is large and exaggerated. And then if you wanted to like slow things down and have a really intimate game, like going from Uncharted to The Last of Us, all of my references are like 12 years old at this point because I've been working on Dreams for 6 years solid, so I'm sorry about that. So going from like Uncharted to The Last of Us, we push the camera right in, which means the character moves slower, which means the environment can be like a smaller, more intimate space, and you get a different tone. So there's like a tonal difference just from these mechanical changes, which are all tied together. My mouth's so dry, I hope this is over soon. So I mean, I say that, but we're going to have to like chat all day about this stuff, so I should just drink a bottle of water instead. Oh, luckily, that's what I've just said. So yeah, how a game feels is a combination of all these three. So if you're going for a very specific tone, keep that tone in mind and just keep sort of tweaking all of these three variables until you feel like you've reached that tone. And I think it just goes from, like, I think it's a scale from like arcadey to realistic in terms of like slowing things down. Generally, you don't get games that are slower than real life. Well, you might do, but I think I've never seen one. So always show the player where they need to go. So this is basically the level design counterpoint to the puzzle version where I said give the player a clear objective or a clear problem to solve. Remember the picture where it's got like a door with a key on it, a lock on it, which is a very clear problem to solve. This is the level design version of it. And you'll hear things, you might have like read things about like, I think they're called weenies, like, which is sort of like an object in the distance you've got to try and get to. So that's like a really, really common level design tool to sort of like tell the player where they need to go. So back when I was a student, it was always Half-Life 2. People would talk about Half-Life 2 and you'd see the citadel in the distance. I don't know what a more contemporary version of that is. So yeah, I've drawn like a maze because that would really frustrate people. And as well, if the player doesn't have a clear sort of destination that they're trying to get to, they're going to spam your level and go in all directions, which means they're going to hit the boundaries of your level much quicker than if they were directed. If they're clearly directed, then they'll go along the path that you have designed for them, and they won't hit the boundaries as frequently, and which will kind of just sort of have this feeling of the level being more believable, the space being more believable, than if they sort of start to aimlessly like push at every nook and cranny and try and sort of like push at the edges of the level. Because when you're walking around the real world, you'll find that there's very few dead ends ever, really. To be honest, there's like the general layout, say of this university campus, is very porous, and every single time you go around a corner there's like 12 opportunities. That's an expensive level to build because you've got this clear path that you want the player to go on. You're not going to bother with all this extraneous stuff at the edges, but if they don't know where they're going, they're going to want to go there. So if they sort of come across boundaries and blockages at every corner, it's going to start to feel a little bit staged and fake. So having a really clear objective marker at the end where they know they need to get to can help funnel them along the path that you want them to go on. Oh yeah, there's my Half-Life 2 example. Orienting the player using landmarks. So that's a really, really clear way to do it. I think that is probably geographically the strongest way of sort of leading the player in a certain direction. But yeah, if anyone's got any other ideas, we should chat about them because I want to nick your ideas. Using denial and reward to enrich an experience. So this is similar to what I was talking about right at the start when I was talking about designing for mystery. So if you could see your objective marker in the end, you can see your citadel and you can see a clear path towards it. It becomes a very laborious journey because you're like, I can see exactly where I'm going to go. I've already done all my problem solving. I'm a little bit bored now because it's just work. I'm just going to go along this path. But if you can see your objective and you're not sure how to get there, or maybe you can sort of like vaguely make out a path that you think will work, but it's obscured by like a small thicket of trees or something, or like it goes inside a building and then you think it comes out the other side, but you're not sure. If there's some element of mystery there, some element of like problem solving that the player hasn't quite finished yet, then they will probably be more engaged. And I think that sort of depends on the kind of player that you've got, but we can only design for what we think is good or enjoyable to ourselves, so that's how I go. Like basically, the problem solving aspect is really, really exciting to me, so I would try and you can kind of make out a path there, if you think it leads to that little building on the hill, but you have to travel the whole length of that path to find out for sure, because it might be that it goes around this corner and there's a river to cross, or some sort of like obstacle in your path. So building hierarchically is just a level design tip to make sure that you don't burn out by sort of building at the wrong scale to start with. So say if you want to achieve this cityscape on the right, you wouldn't start by building like a curb or a lamppost, because then you would never finish it basically, would you? So you've got like an amount of time that you want to spend on this project, and you've got a scale that you want to achieve. So the best way to do that, to make sure that you can definitely finish, is by building at the lowest level of detail possible and building the whole thing first, and then being like, okay, cool, I've at least built this thing at like a very low level of detail, and then sort of modularly like increasing the level of detail evenly across the whole thing. So you would never end up with a level where you've got one house which is super high detail and the rest of it which is not, because you haven't been able to finish that. You only had enough time for one building. So when you sort of play games, you might notice games that have gone for like a more stylized art style, or like a much more sort of cartoony aesthetic, and it might be because that is an achievable art style for the scale of game that they wanted to create. So you guys use like Maya and Unreal, I guess, most of the time. So this might be interesting. I might get told off by your tutors actually. So I always advocate building in perspective, because although this is really good, this is an orthographic view that I mocked up. Although this is really good for laying things out, it tells you nothing about how a level feels to be in. So you can either use a combination of them, or like for myself, we've been working in Dreams for 6 years, and you only use perspective in that because it's just a PlayStation game. And I think that's fine. I think that works really well. And I think it also encourages you to go a bit off the grid, because when you're in orthographic, you've got these big grid lines behind you, and obviously like you're working in a square window. So what that does is it sort of like focuses you on like building a sort of a very rigidly gridded square environment, which can feel quite unrealistic when you're sort of like building when you step into a space. So if you build orthographically, like we've got this beautiful tool in Dreams, which is just called the upright tool, and it basically disregards all grid lines apart from so basically you can place objects at any angle, and you know that they'll be up. They'll be like standing upright, because really that is the only grid line, is like the direction of gravity for us. It doesn't really matter. If you looked at like a map of the UK, nothing is like perfectly facing north, and that's because no other direction really matters. I think they locally matter, like you wouldn't want your walls of your building to be sort of like wonky, but you would probably want your building to be wonky next to the next building. I know that's a bit of a pain, and probably not what you've been taught, but I kind of advocate for a little bit of chaos and messiness there, because I think it makes things feel a little bit more realistic. And definitely building in perspective tells you what a game is going to feel like. But better than building in perspective is regularly playing your game, because you might sort of like go down to perspective view and build a scene, but that might not be the camera perspective that the player will get. So the only way to make sure is to jump into your game and play it as soon as possible, and often, and just play it, because you'll notice things that the player would notice that the designer might not. So you might sort of see little routes through a level that might look really fun, and that will inform your design decisions later. So you'll start building for those. You start building for player's experience, which is ultimately the goal. I should have put these right at the start, because these are a little bit more academic and a bit dry. So static compositions can be at rest. So this is talking about like when you're building a game, you've probably got like an emotional experience that you have in mind. Basically, I think kind of you can boil all design down to trying to communicate a feeling to players. So if you're making a horror game, you want them to feel uneasy and scared. If you're making like a puzzle game, you might want them to feel like comfortable and assured. And if you're making like an action game, you might want them to feel heroic and like unstoppable. So like those are feelings that you're trying to convey, and you should use every tool in your arsenal to sort of convey those in whichever way possible. And this is just another thing that people might not have considered, but like the type of geometry can communicate different things. So static things that are like square, they convey like stability and sturdiness. So you might say if you want the player to sort of climb on something, you might make it blocky and bulky. Or if you want them to hide behind something, you might make it blocky and bulky. Rounded shapes feel safe, and angular shapes feel dangerous. So it's like really simple. It's like triangles, circles, and squares. One feels sturdy, one feels soft and safe because it's got all of like loads of rounded edges, and one feels dangerous because it's pointy like a spike. It's really simple. So I think that's slightly different from what these slides are trying to communicate, but they're related. They're all sort of like shape psychology. So this is a dynamic shape. It's a bit like a blob of porridge, but that is an example of like a dynamic shape which feels like it's in motion. So that makes people feel uneasy, makes people want to move around. It's really weird. I don't know. Use that if you can. But if you look at architecture, sometimes people use a lot of this kind of thing, like is it Zaha Hadid? She made like incredible sort of like buildings that feel really like dynamic and like they're moving. She's just like an incredible architect. But if you check out her stuff and then compare it to like a tower block, you'll see what I mean. You'll get a different emotional response from kind of shapes. I love shapes. So here, like it's showing that different geometric shapes will move the player in different ways. So if you're in a circular room, you'll actually move like you're likely to move in every direction. So you don't know where the player's going to go because everywhere is sort of equal. And that sort of talks to if you've not got an objective, you're going to push against every single boundary. And imagine this block on the left, which is sort of like a long corridor. You're not going to bounce off the walls of the corridor because it communicates like going down to the further end of the corridor. So yeah, like even shapes are going to like not have a direction, like a prevalent direction that the player will go down. So try to make things like uneven, and then you'll probably be able to control where the player goes a bit better. And I've been talking about this throughout the whole thing because I kind of think that's like the point of a lot of these rules is to sort of build a tone or reinforce a tone of the game that you're trying to make. So once you've got a tone and you know your tone, you probably have like a tone map or an idea of what you want your tone to be really, really early on as soon as you start your game. You can use that to sort of inform everything. So this is talking about like, so for example, like there's a moment in The Last of Us with like a bunch of giraffes where I use this sort of technique. So you have a really fluid sort of chase sequence where you're sort of like following Ellie, who's getting really excited because she sees like a wild animal. And there's a real high point on the roof where she's like a big, open, airy, sort of like vibrant space, and you have this really beautiful moment. And then as soon as that's finished, you sort of crash back down to the reality of what's actually happening. So I make the player go through a door and down a dark staircase to a dingy room, because that's sort of emotionally where you're going from sort of like a really high upbeat moment back down to reality, which is like a downbeat moment. So that's So yeah, that's an example of building on the tone of your story, but it's also an example of like sequential spaces contrasting each other, which makes it feel more impactful. This goes on forever, doesn't it? I've written a lot. Yeah. Let a space grow naturally. So this is obviously sort of, do this where possible. This is ideal, but it can be expensive, I guess, if you've got a small team. So the arrows in this picture point to where you as a designer want the player to go. That's the critical path. If you were like speedrunning a game, you just like flow straight through that. But it's a house, and houses have rooms, and not every single room is going to have like a bookcase shoved up against the back of every single door. So you're going to basically, you've got these spaces that the players expect to be explorable, and you should build them out, because if players expect things to be there, they should be there. So you either have to contrive ways for every single room to be like inaccessible, which is going to get really tired and boring and old very quickly, or you can just accommodate them. You can just like accommodate what the player expects to be there. And you might end up with, well, you might get a lot of artists moaning that you've given them way too much work, but you might also sort of, the thing that I used to do is sort of try and justify these spaces in new ways. So I'd like, you know, I know you have to build this whole other building over here, but I've hidden a really cool collectible in it. So like now it's part of the gameplay, now it's valid. I stole this one, like verbatim from like a book, which I'll recommend at the end of this. But basically, the more specific a design idea, the greater its appeal will be. So, which I think just comes back to designing things that you would want to play, because you're a person who's got very specific tastes. Build those specific tastes if you can. Find a company that you feel like is aligned with your specific tastes, and you'll probably do a lot better than if you sort of find a company that you don't really sort of like get on board with, you don't really enjoy their games. Because if you try and appeal to everyone, you kind of end up appealing to like nobody, because everyone will always go for something that appeals specifically to them or as close as possible to them. So if you think about like a game that kind of does everything but isn't the best at anything, then that will have a very low player base. Whereas you find a game that maybe just does like one thing incredibly well, it will probably have like a really hardcore fan base because it's appealing to a very specific type of person. This is something that I really love to do really early on. I think it's really important, but like basically giving a journey a purpose. So if you boil it down, if you sort of like turned on all the collision that you put into a beautiful level, you'll see that your level is actually like quite, the play space is actually quite small, and it's like quite an ordinary path. It's probably like, say this, it's basically comparing this staircase to this mountain. One is where the player will go, one is what the player will feel, right? Like, so, say even if it's this mountain, you could only access that sort of thin path up the mountain, it would still feel a bit more epic, a bit more like an adventure. You've given it a context, you've given it like a tone and a context that the player can get on board with. So starting early on with that kind of thing, that kind of thing will help you as a designer or an artist get inspired, and if you're more inspired, you're more enthused, then you're going to build better work anyway. So just do it for yourself because it's more fun. Yeah. So if you can't explain, so you'll have had this a million times when you're like chatting with your with your friends about game ideas, and you're trying to communicate ideas to them. And sometimes you've got an idea and you think it's incredible, and you try and communicate it to someone, and it's really hard to communicate that specific feeling or tone or that specific mechanic. But if it's hard to communicate, that is a warning sign that it's probably not as good an idea as you thought it was. So the best ideas are ones that flow really naturally, and you explain them to someone and they're like, I can imagine playing that, that sounds really exciting. Oh yeah, this is like telling me off. It says, some people use overly complex and meaningless language, so I think a bunch of the stuff I say today falls into that category. In an attempt to gain recognition and respect, so don't respect me. So yeah, try and use everyday language, and don't try and sort of like bamboozle and confuse people with words that don't mean anything. And yeah, if you explain it to someone that doesn't play games and they're excited, then you you might have like a hit on your hands, to be honest, because that's really, really rare. But yeah, so just using each other as a sounding board, like explaining things to your friends, because like so it's like a revision technique as well, isn't it? Sort of trying to explain things to people, because you can't explain something to someone until you fully understand it yourself. And if you try and explain something to someone and it falls apart, then maybe it sort of like worked emotionally in your head, but mechanically it actually doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So like just trying to say things out loud, or like write them down, or chat to your friends about them, all the more stupid, but it will galvanize your ideas and make them stronger, and you'll sort of learn quickly to sort of like throw away ideas that are not working and keep ideas that are working really well. Oh yeah, so I'm like so ahead of myself today. Don't be afraid to throw away. Oh no, that's totally wrong. I thought that was going to say don't be afraid to throw away game ideas, and I was wrong. It says don't be afraid to throw away good ideas, because so even if you've got this catalogue of really good ideas, not every single one will fit into the game that you're currently making. And sometimes games can take a really long time. So you might sit on these ideas for years, you might sit on them forever. But if you try and cram every single idea that you've got into the game you're currently making, you're gonna try to put things in a game that aren't appropriate and don't tonally work. And that's just going to result in a worse game. Basically, sort of think of the game as a cohesive whole, and you're sort of just trying to make that thing as good as possible, regardless of sort of like your personal, your personal sort of like ideas, and trying to make your specific small part as good as possible for your portfolio. You've got to think, you've got to service the game basically, and it can result in some like legitimately good ideas being cut for reasons that. Basically, it doesn't mean that the ideas are bad. You can just shelve them and keep them for later. Like there was a really cool section that I sort of like prototyped for The Last of Us, where you didn't have a flashlight and you're going through a building. You had a camera, and so you'd click the camera and the flash would sort of like, it was almost like it would just flash momentarily like a couple of times, and you'd see the environment, and then you'd have to move through the environment while the camera flash sort of warmed up again. So you would like walk across these planks, but you'd have to walk across them in the dark, having seen what you've previously seen, and then you could hear like all these clickers below you. And it kind of worked mechanically really well, but like mechanically it didn't line up at all with any point in the game. We had no idea where to put it, and it didn't work in the game, so it got cut. So yeah, it's just like try and be really gracious when your ideas don't fit. Just stick them in your back pocket, use them later. I think they'll all get used at some point, or they might build into other ideas. But you could never fit every single idea that you've got into a single game. It would be a really weird game if you did that. I'm sure someone's done that, and it's resulted in a horrendous game. I like this diagram because it's quite humbling. I think this doesn't work. This diagram, this Venn diagram, I've done it wrong basically. But it communicates what I'm trying to say. So a designer should know a little bit of most disciplines, if possible, but they are not a specialist in particularly anything. So I'm trying to show that like designers overlap with every discipline, but they don't have as big a sphere of influence as any other discipline on their own. So everyone else is basically, I see every other discipline as like a professional or an expert, and a designer is, well, just like trying their best and playing a lot at making games. That's sort of how I see it. I don't feel like I'm I haven't got an expertise in any of those areas. So you have to know about art, and you have to be able to be competent at art and talk to artists and understand art, but you are not an artist. You might be, but I'm not. You have to understand programming and understand the limitations and the advantages of like programming. And when a programmer says that's not possible in our current engine, you have to like understand their expertise. Same with audio and same with animation, because those are all tools that you're going to use as a designer. You're not going to be the person that implements it. You're going to have to work as a team. So this diagram would work if there was like a really tiny circle here, and it overlapped all these big these other four circles. So just understand each discipline's limitations and try and work with them, I guess. I won't dwell on that. I think that's the end. Yes, it's the end. Okay, so I hope that was interesting, and I'm going to be around for a bunch of time, so if anyone has any questions, we can just hang out and chat. Does anyone have any questions now? Or not? They can't. Yes.
What, in your experience, has been the process of applying for and getting a job as a game as a level designer in the industry?
So, in my experience, I just went to events and met people that were designers at companies that I wanted to apply for. So I went to a thing called Animex in Middlesbrough, and there were a bunch of gaming lectures. I actually went there. I don't think anyone else from my course went, but a bunch of illustrators went. So I went there with those guys, and on the evening they'll usually have like a period of time in like a bar or something where you can take your portfolio and show like the industry representatives that are there talking. And I got chatting to one of them, and they said, like, please apply when you finish. So, and like that opportunity literally arose because I went to this event and hung out and showed them my portfolio when I finished. But they're very understanding about that kind of thing. There are like job fairs in Manchester, I know, that we went to. But yeah, I do remember sort of coming back to my class and everyone being like, how come you've got like this contact already? And I was like, well, you guys didn't go to this thing. You didn't meet these people, and you've got to put yourself out there. Like, it's like when people are working in games, they're generally, they have a deadline, because you always have a deadline, and it's generally like quite a lot of work. So games industry people don't go out of their way necessarily to like find like new talent, although it is like the lifeblood of the industry, so it's really important. But we kind of like hope that you folks will be really forthcoming with your talents and come to us and shout at us and like not let us forget that you're like really important and got a lot to offer. So that's generally the way it goes. You guys have to go out there and put yourselves out there and find people. And like with things like Twitter and stuff, it must be easier. Like there's probably a lot more voices, but there is a lot more opportunity to get heard as well. Like I think the thing to remember is like, if you like chat to someone, they'll feel important. They'll feel like they know what they're talking about now because someone has asked them a question and so most people will reply and respond and give you advice or like they go a name forward for a job. But yeah, unfortunately, you folk have to be the people to like push out there and get heard. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yes, Lisa.
When you were studying at uni, was it obvious that level design was the thing that you excelled at the most? Or was it sort of...
I think I started wanting to be an artist, and then I joined the course and there was just a bunch of really good artists, and I was like, man, this sucks. And because I think this course, like, I think it is pretty even. Like, I think it's probably maybe like even more art oriented than design sometimes. I don't know. But I think you just sort of have to follow your gut. You have to really listen to your gut, and that goes for everything in game design and probably everything ever. But like, I remember having like little meetings about what we wanted the art style to be, and it was clear that I wasn't the most passionate person in the room. I was like, you go with what you think, I'm not so bothered about that. But then when it came down to the design of the levels and the mechanics, I found myself getting really impassioned and really getting involved and having really strong opinions. And if you've got strong opinions, you just got to listen to that gut and just feel like that is probably what I should be doing. You basically, try and do the thing that you enjoy the most, and maybe try everything first so that you can work out really clearly and like know really strongly which bit you enjoy the most. Hope that helps. Yes.
Like, let's say you were working on a game and someone said like, can you design me a level for like a suburb city or something like that, and like you knew all of the like mechanics you already had and stuff like that. What would be like your pipeline, like your work pipeline to like go ahead designing a level like that?
So I think you'd start with like an overriding your story beats. So you'd start with emotionally where the character starts, emotionally where the character ends. Hopefully that's a different point, so you get some change over the course of the level. And then any beats in the middle. So like literally for like Last of Us levels, we would sit down in a room with like the game director and the creative director, and they would be like, this is where you start, this is where you end, these are the 2 beats in the middle that we think are really important, and then you start chatting about what those beats are. Once you've got like an emotional roadmap, then it's quite easy to sort of like start building geometry around that, because you basically sort of, and the geometry doesn't have to mirror it. So like an example I always like is like Resident Evil 2, because it's a horror game, it's really claustrophobic, it's really scary, and it's set in like a well-lit police station, which is like a police station somewhere people feel safe, and it's well lit. This is like a horror movie that is not like completely shrouded in darkness. So that's like juxtaposing those 2 tones together, and to great effect, because you feel safe and then you're not. Like it's sort of like it's you on edge a little bit. So I don't think you have to be like, oh, we've got like a really sad story moment here, so it's gonna fucking rain and it's gonna be dark and it's gonna be horrible. You're gonna be walking through mud and stuff, because that doesn't always work. It feels a little bit heavy-handed at times. So they can be quite separate, but I think they just have to acknowledge each other. But I would start with the emotional beats, or it could be, that depends on what kind of game it is, I guess. I might be a bit leading in that answer. Yeah, start with your like backbone, whether it's like narrative or puzzle, and then once you've got that little roadmap, build around that. That's what I'd say, and just reference everything. So like for the hospital, I went to a hospital, looked around the hospital. University, we went to like UCLan, walked around that for a day. Yeah, Wild Animals is just a bus station, so that's easy.
I was just kind of curious, like when you do like paper planning, do you then like jump into like straight blockouts and like the UE if you used it, and then or like SketchUp?
I kind of like don't even. I think you probably should. I think it's a good thing to advocate, but I've always found like jumping from 2D to 3D like is really they're so different to me that it's almost like negligible to start 2D. I think I start blocking out in 3D, but I do start with like a paper plan of like I want this beat, this beat, this beat, this beat. That's what they could be, and then you sort of like maybe you think of what the environment could be. So say if you've got like a suburb, and you would just research suburbs and look for interesting things that are in suburbs. So I would say like there's a slide that's not in this, but I probably should have written it up pretty quickly. So if I was doing suburbs, for example, I would say suburbs are kind of boring and like they sort of like they feel very like cookie cutter, don't they? Like every house looks the same. So you would probably try and vary it by like I would build mine on a hill or something, because then you've got like really interesting architecture. You've got like split plans, like housing and things, like where you go in one side, you go in. The door is like on the top level, and you go down some stairs to the kitchen, and then you've got like a garden that's like terraced because it's on like really uneven like terrain. So I might do something like that to make it a bit more interesting. Just try to make it as visually interesting as possible. Like I think a good rule of thumb when you're like playing a level is if you took a screenshot and then you went back to it a week later, could you recognize where that was? If you're like, I don't know, it could be any of 7 places, then you've got a level that isn't varied enough to sort of remain engaging. But if you took a screenshot and you're like, I know exactly where that is, then you've probably got a level that is really good. And you can use top-down sort of views to sort of like tell you how interesting it is. Like when I use the orthographic example, if you look at your thing and it fits on a grid neatly, it's not got a lot of variety. But if you sort of look at your top-down orthographic view and everything's kind of like at odd angles, then it probably will look a little bit more like if you're looking at like an actual map of a city, and it's going to be more interesting. Like that. Yes.
So when you're designing a level, what kind of process do you go through to like self-critique and go, okay, I like what's going on here, but is it meeting its highest potential?
I think just play it all the time.
Right.
Play it as much as possible, get other people to play it. Getting other people to play it is brutal, but it's really important actually, because you will play your level the same way every single time. And it's just, I'm always shocked at how many dumb things I put in levels when I get someone else to play it, and and if someone else plays it and they don't get your level, they're never wrong. That's really hard to swallow, but like it's true. Like that could be someone that bought your game and they spent 30 quid on it and they played it and they're like, I don't know where to go, and then they stop playing it and then they never go back to it. So like it's really really like difficult, but I think like play your level as much as you possibly can anyway, and then get other people to play it regularly, and then just try to be gracious when they tell you your level's terrible. You have to change it up. So that will happen. Any more questions? Yes?
Have you ever seen like a different game and thought to yourself, oh, like an aspect of level design and thought, I wish I thought of that?
Yeah, all the time, yeah.
Any examples?
It's a shame that we can't all come up with all the ideas, but yeah, that's, yeah, totally. I can't think of an example right now, but I mean, obviously, like before I got into the games industry, like everything I saw in graphic design was stuff that I wish I'd come up with because I hadn't made anything at that point. Yeah. I don't know. I can't think of anything off the top of my head. But yeah, that happens a lot.
We all cool? Super. Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.